As a former member of Congress, I'm happy to be invited just about anywhere in America. And also, I must say, Jim and I do go back a long ways. I think where we really met, we probably met before this, but we're engaged, was on that fuel economy standards study. And Jim was really the key person who organized the subcommittee that helped come up with these things. And the one thing I've long respected Jim for is that he has used his academic training, his mind and discipline in the energy of the society in terms of trying to find policy decisions and ways in which we can advance important social goals. And he's been very skilled. Of course, many of you have dealt with him personally on this for quite some time. And so I did say yes, in large part because you called, Jim, and also because since I'm aging, or I gather I'm now morphine, as you say, I'm just delighted to be here. But I'm particularly delighted to be here in California talking about climate change. You have to understand I come from Indiana, and I live now in Washington, D.C., and these are not, at the moment, the places that you want to go in America to look to the future, I hope. And I do have to say about my races, when Mike Pence was running, I was an established politician. He was getting started, and he lost. And my liberal friends want to put that on my tombstone, and I urge them to delay. But let me say, what is special about being here in California is precisely the fact that you have an active government, whether you agree with everything that it does or not. You have a very robust marketplace of innovation and entrepreneurs in the clean energy space, among others. And you have, third, this incredible dynamic system of private organizations and institutions, from foundations to universities to private citizen organizations and activist groups. That is what is the energy that makes possible in America us really beginning to take on these challenges. And there are voices around the country who say, well, without radical reform of our constitutional structure, without radical reform of our political system, we're just never going to be able to take on these challenges. I'm not one of the people that actually believes that, and in the questions, if you want to pursue that, but there are other questions I think more important at the moment. And in part, I understand why they say that. They see such entrenched, established energy systems and land management systems, economic systems. They see excessive money in our politics, and these are certain things that may need reforming. But the truth is, that if we will capitalize on our markets, on our government, and on our civil society, I think that we can actually do this. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. Actually, I'm here to try to talk about my focus on the federal government action in this important sector. And I'm going to make some comments from a 50,000-foot perspective. You're less likely to hit another plane that way. But you ask questions or push me, and we'll see if I can fly it a little lower. And what I'm going to be talking about is what might have been with Trump over the last 2 years, what new initiatives are coming on both sides of the political aisle in Washington since the 2018 election, and finally a little bit of broad-scale speculation on what might be. Well, let me start with a fantasy about what might have been over the last 2 years. When James Baker and George Shultz, two longtime conservative leaders in this country, highly respected in a very broad swath of American politics, went to Washington, or at least got the message to Washington with the new administration, what about a carbon tax with a revenue-neutral carbon tax? And they advocated this strongly. Well, many economists favor this. In our complex economy, it's a powerful incentive. It helps move investment decisions, consumer decisions, and stimulate innovation. And it, of course, allows, while they had a particular view on what to do with the revenue, it allows the revenue to be used in multiple ways. For example, it might have paid for part of the tax cuts and stopped some of the ballooning of the deficit. It might have also gone to assist coal miners that the president claimed he was trying to support in this politics. But we know that fantasy, which is really a conservative intellectual fantasy, was not to be. And instead, the Trump administration decided to spread ignorance, Ignorance about the science, ignorance about what's required by the Paris Agreement, ignorance about the costs of taking action in our economy in order to cut emissions, and ignorance especially about the costs of inaction, which increasingly we're now facing, not in the distant future, but we're beginning to face now. They obviously tried to repeal regulations. It's a hard process, and they only got at it this week, finally, on the coal plants in the country. They have pending their rule on the auto standards, going back on some of the important steps that had been taken on a bipartisan basis under the Bush administration, the second Bush administration. And these are being challenged in court and whatnot. In the budget, they tried desperately to cut. Their first recommendation, cut ARPA-E, which I trust some of you are engaged with and know about. It's our innovative technology. And by the way, that's an extraordinary agency because it was an innovation in the way it operates, the way it recruits people, the way it operates with the private sector. It should have been anybody's ideal. And of course, they tried to cut a whole bunch of the science that was going on. Now, fortunately, on a bipartisan basis, during the Republican-controlled Congress, they overwhelmingly rejected these cuts. Now, in addition, of course, they've tried to make changes in the rule-making process, whether it's at EPA or FERC or wherever it is, and trying to take out or reduce the impact of what we call the social, in the regulatory impact analysis that has to go with every rule, which sometimes leads to the defense or the challenge in courts over those rules. They obviously tried to diminish the significance of the social cost of carbon, admittedly a difficult thing to calculate. They've been trying now with the science reports every 4 years. We have the National Climate Assessment. They did publish it last year, which they had to under the law, which of course upped the urgency in this country. But they tried to say, well, the next time around, no worst case scenarios, because of all these really good kind of studies have multiple scenarios. They don't assume they know exactly what the truth is. And then, of course, with the U.S. Geological Survey, they said, oh, you know what? Let's not model anything beyond 2040 because we, of course, don't know, and that's just a mythical kind of operation. Now, admittedly, there is a lot of mythology that can go with modeling, and I think it's very important, but it also has a lot of uncertainties in it. But they decided to do this. Well, last week I was touring with a group of journalists, the laboratories at Columbia University that deal with a lot of climate change, including one of their top scientists on the Antarctica, and he was explaining why that might be relevant, because he said, you know, the ice sheets that are melting there in the Antarctica, as in Greenland, but the ice sheets there are expected, under their modeling, to actually speed up as you begin to get into that time frame of the 2040 era. So, as he said, and as I think is obvious, they're doing everything they can to at least diminish the possibility that people get too worried about the future. Well, they haven't been altogether successful even within their own executive branch. For example, of course, as you probably know, they had the Department of Energy went to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and said, you know what, let's give a special deal to coal plants to keep them going in this country, a special benefit in the regulations. And the FERC, an independent agency chaired by a president's appointment, unanimously said, no, we're not going to go there. Now, they still have on their agenda possibility of considering this. When they turn to the biggest federal utility, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which their board of directors, which again, portions of them were appointed by President Trump, they voted just a month ago or so that they are going to go ahead with their planned closing of several coal plants in the Tennessee Valley area. The administration pushed hard to get them to say, oh, no, back off. Well, let me the one thing that I think is important here in this process is there's been huge pushback internationally, huge pushback domestically. It doesn't mean they're wrong about everything or everybody else is right about everything, but politically it's the wrong direction, I'm convinced, substantively and politically, for the country to be going. But notice one thing that they have failed to do. They had Republican control of Congress, in which the president was supposed to have everybody walking in lockstep with him. And yet, they did not make any substantive changes in the underlying authorities for the regulatory process, whether it's on the Federal Power Act or on the Clean Air Act or on the procedural things you have to do under the APA. They only operated on executive decisions and rulemakings. Now, what that means is, if we get a new president, one that actually believes in leading, which some of us think is critically important, then that person can right away begin trying to reverse the regulatory things where they think it's appropriate to go. They do not have to have total control over the U.S. Congress to revive basic things. My view is that this is actually, from their point of view, a big mistake if they thought they were going to undermine the administrative state. By the way, I'm not here just to defend the administrative state. There's a lot of bullshit that goes on that we could well do without. But nonetheless, this goes back to let's try to govern. Well, since the election in 2018, what we've witnessed is rather surprisingly almost, is major shifts in the kinds of public agenda that have come forth. One on the Democratic side, the Green New Deal, and on the Republican side, something that was sort of beginning to emerge as a strategy of technological innovation. Well, let me speak to the Green New Deal a little bit, and we can get into more specifics if you like a little bit later. But I think it's very important as we characterize, one of the problems that we've had in the public debate so far is just what is this thing, the Green New Deal? It has a wonderful title. It has a number of important things about it, but it's really a political manifesto. It's for inspiring and mobilizing people. The various leaders, if you've heard them speak, they're young, dynamic, smart people. They really argue that what they're trying to do is promote a movement, not to lay out the exact plan for what we ought to do on everything. So that what you have are big goals, big aspirations, and as you know, these goals go well beyond what some of us in our more stovepipe view as to what is exactly climate and what is exactly energy. They involve major social questions as well. Well, what has been the political impact of this sort of thing on, as I think many of you probably already recognize? First of all, it clearly has brought back into the spotlight federal climate action kind of thing. And in a way, there are three kinds of values that I think they have particularly put on the table that's very important. One is, of course, a real sense of urgency, that this is not something to play games about. This is something we have to actively we do. The second is there is a real concern with equity in the country. And then if we're going to have a policy, and I know this is continually debated here in California, is how to make these policies equitable. But of course, they go beyond that. They want full employment and a whole series of things that are very important. And the third, and which is subject to intellectual challenge, but it is that we can have strong climate action and prosperity, that these are not at each other's throats the way Trump and other people claim. Of course, that is going to take some skilled work on the part of policymakers and the private sector. So they are claiming positive short-term benefits in the economy and in the health of our society. Now, the impact on Congress is interesting. There, of course, we know Ocasio-Cortez introduced it on the House side, and Senator Markey introduced the resolution on the Senate side. The important thing to recognize is it's not something you're making a law. It's a resolution that says, here's what we ought to be committed to in the country. That's not a usual process in the country, other than every now and then we had resolutions for motherhood and everything else that went through. So it's a statement of goals and purposes. It's not program and legislation as many of us would have thought. Well, Mitch McConnell decided that he would cleverly get this on the Senate floor and force the presidential candidates and everybody else to vote for it so that they could then pick it apart, since it's open to characterization by everybody because it isn't fully formed kind of thing. And to his surprise, two things happened. One is the Democrats, to my surprise, unanimously agreed that they would all vote present, meaning we're not ready. You need to develop a program. You need to have hearings. You need to do the work, the hard work of legislating before you begin voting on this stuff. And this is crazy, but they all stuck together and voted present in the process. Now, that may have been disappointing to a few supporters of the Green New Deal, but it was very smart politically. But the second thing was, suddenly Republican senators had to respond. Well, what are you going to do? If you're not for the Green New Deal, what are you going to do? And we began to hear some suggestions of that. And we'll get back to that in a moment. Well, the impact, of course, on the presidential candidates on the Democratic side has also been significant. Many of them, finding this new energy, decided to try to co-opt it, and they quickly endorsed in general, with lots of caveats sometimes, the Green New Deal. But generally, none have come out for the one fundamental goal that had caught so much attention, which is to try to have a clean electric system by 2030. But instead, most of them, all but a few, have actually come out for some big goal out there of 2040, 2050, some kind of net zero commitment. Again, these are just goals. They've also clearly, all of them said, we'll immediately revive our position in the Paris Climate Accord, and we will also try to become leaders in the international community where we've been laggards. And there's a variety of other kinds of proposals that have come up, like no more leasing on federal lands. Federal lands are onshore, federal lands are offshore, federal lands are in Alaska, federal lands are all over the place, and they're an important source of production. That is not the same, by the way. It's sometimes confused with stopping current production, which is in the millions of barrels that come off of some of these resources. And they've been fairly cagey about the carbon tax and carbon pricing, but most of them in answering questions say, yeah, I could be open to that, but they clearly aren't putting that forward as this. Now, what it almost certainly means is that this is going to be a major issue in the 2018 campaign, especially if Trump continues to run, as one never knows what he'll do, but he says he is. So in the 2018 or 2020 election, we clearly are going to have it. And that will be the first time it's back on the agenda of a presidential campaign. It managed not to be in almost the last three campaigns. It's hard to remember. And some of you young people here, I guess you were born, but you wouldn't know back in 2008 that we had a Republican candidate for president and a Democratic candidate for president, and both party platforms called for strong action on climate change, McCain and Obama. Then they almost had no questions about it because they were for it, and it was not clear it was a voting issue. I particularly, in dealing with people that are strong supporters of the Green New Deal, I personally urge them that I love the enthusiasm, the commitment, the drive to get things going, but I urge them to be open for the fact that in our system there will be political bargaining necessary to get anything done, and please be open to the possibility of a carbon tax, a little theme I'll keep coming back to here, kind of proposition. Well, let me talk on the other side of the fence. What has been happening on the Republican side, as I'm sure some of you are quite aware, and it's where I'm describing this as a beginning to formulate a position for many of them called a technological strategy of innovative technology as a way to answer this question, invest in technologies that could be transformative if they ever pan out or if they can get adopted in the marketplace. Oh, thanks. Significantly, Senator Barrasso from Wyoming, who's a Republican chair of the Energy and Natural Resource Commission, he came out in December for this proposition. Now, what he's talking about primarily is carbon capture and storage, advanced nuclear fusion, and whatnot. And he actually acknowledged that humans are a major source of the problem here, that it's a problem, that they're a major source, and that he would advocate these kind of innovations, although he wanted them to be a complete substitute for taking any regulatory or any major regulatory or tax action. So this was an alternative strategy. Now, this is a welcome change, given the fact that the senator from Oklahoma wanted to prove to us that it was a problem when he took a snowball on the House floor. It's all a hoax. And a major committee chairman on the Republican side in the House of Representatives from Texas, he belittled the proponents of action by saying, well, you know what, they want to regulate everything. We exhale carbon dioxide. That's what they're going to regulate next. And might not be a bad idea for some of them. But in that debate on the House floor, Senate floor about the Green New Deal, Senator Alexander actually came out with a much more significant statement about how we really have to double over the next 10 years. Some people think it should be a lot more, but the amount of money we spend on technological research and technological advance, and he includes in that clean energy and renewables. Well, let me just say two quick things about that kind of strategy. First of all, many people think it's a very important part of what we've got to do in this country. Not the be-all and end-all, but it's a very important part of this. And there are some folks on the advocacy side who say, nope, we don't need that. Invest your money all. We know what to do now. Just get the political will. Don't do that. But most major studies have come to the conclusion that we really ought to be trying to see what kind of options we can provide our grandchildren in the way of technology, because we can't be sure that the politics, the economics, or the technologies will get us where we have to go. But the second point here is that the real risk in politics in Washington is if this becomes a political excuse for not being willing to do anything else. Well, let me suggest some quick trends that are probably obvious to many of you. It's what we see in sort of the general public debate, not just in Washington, around the country. One of those is that beginning to move away from exclusive focus on renewable portfolio standards, which define exactly which technologies must be developed, kind of thing, to a broader view of, some people would describe this as the clean energy standard, in which you try to make it the goal is zero emissions or net zero or something of that sort, and be more open to innovation and alternative technologies that might develop now or in the future. And of course, this was a debate here, as I understand it, in California, when you said we're talking about the 2045 goal, but it was expanded to allow for something beyond solar, wind, and geothermal, as I understand it, kind of thing. And this is the same thing in a number of states that have stepped forward, even since the last election, to make some kind of commitment themselves about a long-term goal. And even the Green New Deal, which had a lot of behind-the-scenes debate, shifted away to call it a carbon-free as the goal for the electricity system or for the society in general. Second thing is, interesting enough, Jim and I have been dealing with alternative fuels, alternative car and transportation systems, which I know you're going to have a special session on, kind of thing. And generally, the proposition was, well, let's not pick the winner. Let's try to advance a whole bunch of choices. Increasingly, it looks like there's a real focus in many quarters for let's look at electrification of the transportation.
And the other thing I'm asking, make sure there's a question mark at the end of the question. It's not a long statement, although short statements can totally acceptable.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Phil. I'm Jonathan Livingston with Livingston Energy Innovations, and my statement is thank you very much for your remarks.
Oh, thank you.
And I particularly appreciate the upbeat tenor. We're all here, I think, because we have some positive hopes for the future. My question is not so positive. Earlier this year, David Wallace Wells issued his The Uninhabitable Earth, which paints a dire picture of what might happen if we don't succeed in the initiatives that we are collectively pursuing. I wonder if you would be willing to say a word or two about his dire vision, a response, just kind of how you view your thoughts in regards to Mr. Wells' rather negative future perspective. And I
Well-
think for those who haven't read it, it's a perspective of worst case climate change scenarios over the next 80 odd years and how bad things could get. And it's pretty bad. It's a good read, but it's not something you want to read late at night unless you want to sleep. Anyway, I'll stop there. And that is a question.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the question, but I'm really not the person to answer it for two reasons. One is I'm not intellectually on top of all the scientific claims and haven't read his book. So I will avoid that. When I was in Congress, I might have attempted an answer. But I do believe, I simply believe you've got to just do what we can do and what all of us can do. And I have a hunch if we get the dynamism, that's what I'm trying to say is the underlying thing about the structure of our society, is it has the elements that allow for the dynamism of innovation and action. But we have to get different leadership in Washington. I don't think there's any question about that. But that alone doesn't get us off the wing, and we got to do this globally as well. So I don't really have a good answer for you.
Okay, if we get it to Charlie Kolstad right here, right there, and then a person there with a white shirt, and I can't see well enough to see who it is, but anyway, that whoever has the other microphone, if we can bring it to the person with the white shirt whose hand's in the air.
Great talk. Let me just ask a
Thank
very
you, Charlie.
specific
Oh, you
question.
got to identify yourself,
Charlie
Charlie.
Kolstad, Stanford. You know
And
the
former may still be a fellow with the Resources for the Future.
Yes,
Go ahead.
that's right. You know the Midwest politics pretty well. So what kind of horse trading would it take to phase out what is mostly a Midwestern coal industry? What kind of trade-offs would work in that case?
Well, I don't have the exact formula for you on that. I will just say this, that increasingly they are seeing the consequences. It's not just on the sea level rise. They're seeing the consequences of tornadoes and all kinds of storms and floods throughout the Midwest. So I believe it's a matter of there's enough political will if you get some political leaders. Now, that doesn't mean there won't have to be bargaining, but I'm not ready to figure out what that bargain is exactly. The truth is, most people understand that coal is on the way out, and I would just go back to what happened on acid rain, which was we were the guilty party in Indiana, and most of us voted for the acid rain provisions in 1990. But what made it possible, in part politically, or may have helped us, was the fact that the President of the United States, Republican, George Bush, #1, stood up and said, this is a real problem. We've got to do something about it. It's amazing the turnaround in the numbers of people that changed their minds with some leadership. So my hope is that what we're beginning to see is like with Senator Alexander and others, that as they begin to say, and by the way, their children come home, and if you've had children, as some of us have, we learn that it's not a one direction in the way information flows in the family, and they begin to press us. I have great hopes this new generation ain't going to sit still, and they won't. And the Midwest will come around. But look, when I say bargaining, everybody's not going to be under the tent. You just have to get a broad enough coalition. And so there are people that have to be defeated in politics. There's positions that have to be defeated, but you don't expect everybody to get on the same wavelength. So Charlie, no real answer again.
Over the next over there, and then there's a whole bunch of people, but next with a white shirt. Identify yourself.
Chris Jitzi, Stanford Chemistry.
I can't
I
see where
take
you-
your point. I'm sorry.
Oh, there we are. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I take your point and appreciate what you said about commentators who look at the yellow vests or the Washington state vote and despair of carbon pricing. And I also take your point that the politics of this are going to be complicated and may need a lot of trade-offs. I want to ask, though, specifically about carbon prices where it's all returned, not used for governmental functions, but all returned on a per capita basis, the so-called tax and dividend, fee and dividend plans. And what the politics of that is, whether you can imagine a coalition within the next 4 to 8 years that can agree to get the equity piece just by giving people back the money they're paying for, extra money they're paying for carbon? Thank you.
Well, that's, of course, a very prominent proposal set forward, and I'm delighted when people are energized and trying to make it happen or make any other formulation happen. I'm a little agnostic. In part, Resources of the Future did a lot of economic modeling and things about different results of applying it to the deficit, cutting corporate taxes, cutting individual taxes, returning it. And I think I'm fair to their analysis. There are some pluses over 25 or 30 years to one over the other, but generally the proposition comes out that neither from an economic broad standpoint of economic growth matters a lot. Kind of proposition. There are differences as to the application. So your question is, politically, would it be more saleable if we had used this thing? My own view is that's exactly what needs to be negotiated and what we can get away with in negotiation. First of all, I think it's much more likely that we'd be seen, instead of doing all of it, we would end up doing portions of it to different ways. Some people have even advocated dangling it out, some of it out in front of the states to pay for their transportation systems or something like that if they'll do X, Y, and Z kind of proposition. And that's what good politicians try to figure out. And I don't think it's possible to intellectually define exactly what that is or politically kind of proposition. So again, probably another disappointing answer, but I distinguish between trying to advocate and get action on something. The other is, I can imagine a town meeting back in my district in which somebody says, well, first of all, the first question is, why did you take it away from us? And now you're trying to give it back. What kind of game is this? That's sort of at the ignorant level. But at the equity level, I can imagine them saying, well, he's got lots of money. He's a Stanford professor. Why would he get the same check I get? Also, I have to use twice as much energy. I have to heat my pool. Excuse me, I'm getting crazy now. I'm coming to California. But you get what I'm saying is the notion that this is so copacetic and everybody will just accept this as, oh, I see, instead of why did you try to buy me off politically? However, if I can demonstrate that your taxes were cut, and not just from my White House speech, kind of proposition, you may find that more acceptable. And what we're looking for here is acceptability of a policy. So I'm not against that, and that may work in some instances. The other is, you have to remember that we are not as clever in this society and organized as we think we are in terms of trying to get those back to everybody. So with taxpayers, we have that information. With Social Security, we have that information. But there are millions of American citizens. So you're going to want to have low-income energy assistance. That's one of the proposals. We've been doing it for 25 years, but that's one of the proposals in the Green New Deal, and different techniques. And remember this, most people are not going to focus on this. That's the nature of our society. So they're not going to sit back and listen to the argument and agree or disagree. We have to have political leaders that are willing to negotiate. And the most important thing is, if we can get people to understand we've got to act, it's amazing they'll give you a lot of leeway, or they'll give you a lot of lip and then turn around and vote for you. At least that was my experience.
There was a person with a microphone in the back, I believe, and then could we get another over to Amber Mace, the person with in white over there, in green and white. Good colors for this.
Thanks so much for your comment. I'm Max Henry, CEO of Lumina Decision Systems. I actually was going to ask the question that the previous gentleman asked, but instead I will do a kind of follow-on. So, in terms of the politics of a carbon price, carbon tax, we talk about cutting taxes. If we look at the Gilets jaunes, the yellow jackets in France, they are mostly rural people.
Right.
And I think a lot of the objections in the US will be people from farms, rural areas where they have low incomes, don't pay so much tax in many cases, but have a relatively large carbon footprint because they need to use a lot of gasoline. And direct equal amount payment to each person is going to be, that they actually would come out as net gainers for the most part. And so I'm just wondering what you think about that as a technique, because that's a critical constituency. How are we going to convince them to accept this?
Well, first of all, I just would take issue with that kind of academic analysis that, well, if we look at the averages across the country, they will win or they will lose. That's maybe legitimate, but it really is quite different. There are lots of rich people that live in the, or the farmers and others that live in these areas. And by the way, we have to change agricultural processes very much so. That's another big thing on the agenda. So again, I would just argue, let the politicians begin to work that out. What you'll be surprised at is if you can get the pressure on them, and this is what all of us can do as citizens, exercise our First Amendment right to petition the government, is to say, what are you doing and how fast are you doing it? And it's not acceptable that you think this is a hoax. Somebody else?
Thank you for your leadership and your perspectives. I'm Amber Mace. I'm the Executive Director of the California Council on Science and Technology. And as you know, climate change science has become very politicized. And we have a number of, so many scientists and engineers who want their research to be relevant and impactful. Can you talk about the pros and cons of our scientists and engineers engaging in this space, and maybe offer some recommendations, particularly for those who are just getting started in this space?
Well, first of all, understandably, for some of the scientific community, this is not their bag, and they don't want it to be, and it shouldn't be. That's not what they're engaged in. They're trying to figure things out, and that's good. Now, what we also need, as you point out, is we need those that will help translate that, and that may be a different set of people, like your organization. And fortunately, what's happened, unfortunately, because of the slowness of dealing with cap and trade, we now have any number of national organizations that are helping to communicate science. There is one thing that we do want to be careful about, is being true to the science. And this is a fundamental in which scientists and the others need to be. If we begin claiming claims that cannot be documented and cannot be proven, or we're not clear on the characterization, we open it up to the kind of criticism against science. Well, there they are, playing games again, doing this kind of stuff. So I'd say, first of all, stay in your lane. But there's another lane that some of them can engage in and others can't, and that is that to begin to communicate this kind of thing. We had this was an issue at Resources of the Future continually as to how to communicate that. And the question you want to ask your research is, so what? Does it matter? And second of all, who cares? And by who cares, I mean, who's the audience? And then you write for that audience, or you communicate to that audience. And we have, the general public's hard to reach. And by the way, they never have and they never will all agree. Don't forget the Scopes trial in the 1920s.
Okay, what is next? Right here.
Jeff Alfs, I'm with Peninsula Clean Energy. We're a community choice entity provider here on the peninsula. You said something interesting earlier, if I understood you correctly. You said we're on the cusp of major federal legislation on climate. My question is that reading tea leaves, or is that or is that really concrete information? And the second part of that is, when California and other states are pushing forward aggressive things on climate, on our goals for carbon-free electricity, for example, is it influencing? It's influencing some of our federal officials. Is it influencing anyone beyond kind of the blue states? Are we preaching to the choir, or are we actually having an impact on the red state people that we really kind of need to jump on board?
Repeat your first part. I forgot.
Well, the first part was just you said we're on the cusp of.
Oh yes.
Is it
No, that's pure speculation and tea leaves, but it is based on the fact that polling shows the American people are moving that direction. These two political things that I'm trying to show you is at the minute that it becomes recognized that it's not smart, frankly, wise Republican commentators and legislators and others, they know that they're in a losing battle over time if they're with the new generation and being rejected if they continue an anti-science, anti-rejectionist kind of point of view. So that is clearly changing. It may take another couple of years, but we're going to get there. The second is California does matter. First of all, we in Indiana and everywhere else, we'd say, oh, well, there they go again, and they're going to try something. And if it works, we might adopt it in 50 years from now. And if it doesn't work, we were proven right. But the point is that other states are clearly adopting this New York thing they're about to vote on. They're trying to claim they're ahead of California. Well, they aren't, but that's, so you keep up. So it is influencing that you can do proposition. Now, that's not to say, and you guys have to debate it yourselves as to whether this is the most cost-effective and the most effective ways to do things here in California.
Emmy Stenstead Elsis, thanks you for this easy question. Can you hazard a guess at what carbon tax rate would be effective?
I've been all over the lot. I don't have one. Lots of people say $40, $50 start with, and of course, we're always talking about a rising rate, whatever it is, so that you warn investors it's going to get stiffer and stiffer kind of proposition. That's the nature of this. Now, look, I don't think a carbon tax is the be-all and end-all by any stretch of the imagination. And first of all, if it's not really stiff, you're going to have no impact on transportation for a number of years. But getting it in there is the kind of thing that helps incentivize all kinds of good things. But it's part of a broad strategy of things we have to do in this country.
Nicola Pio-Malter from VMware Technologies. I have an answer for your question. Colorado State Representative Chris Hansen just submitted and passed legislation called the Colorado Energy Impact Assistance Act, and it's for retiring coal plants in Colorado. And what's unique about it is it addresses all of the stakeholder concerns. So for the utilities, it actually pays them through municipal bond funding to make them whole in retiring their stranded assets. It also helps the coal plant workers find retraining, et cetera, so compensates them in the local towns that are going to be suffering from the closing. So it actually comprehensively and actually cost effectively retires coal plants. And I think that's some of the resistance. It's actually real, it's like economic, it's on the ground. And so it's incredibly smart legislation that I think could be a model for the rest of the country.
Thank you.
Well, you're probably absolutely right.
There, yeah, let him answer, but move the microphone over there.
This is the value of our
Herman,
system.
I think.
We're going to find different ways to do that. Now, this could go back to the question of if some of that carbon tax went back to the state of Colorado, is it Colorado, did you say? Where? Yeah, then that may help the state and incentive in other states to be able to do similar kinds of things. But that's only one kind of formulation. But what you have there is the really important thing is we do need to recognize, and I kind of dismissed it here, that there are real impacts with policy choices, and you just don't leave everybody in the dust.
There's a hand up. Yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm
And by the way, I'm going to call this the last question, unless somebody stands up and really jumps up on the table and complains.
Thank you. I'm Ripu Malhotra, retired now, formerly from SRI International. Thank you very much for your lovely presentation, inspiring. I agree with you the urgency for deep decarbonization. But as I look around, we see the need for a lot more energy. We are really short, particularly electricity, because we want to convert our transportation system into electrical, and we have to provide a lot more of cloud services and all that, all of which take lots and lots of more energy. Given that we are short of energy, the idea of turning down or closing down working nuclear power plants seems like continuing to dig a hole yourself that you find yourself in.
Well,
my question to you is...
That's an amen here, but go ahead.
I want from you something to... How can we convince the people? What can we do to reverse this trend that we are seeing in so many places in state? In California, we've already shut down 2. We are about to shut down the third one. How can we resist that? And
Well-
what advice can you give us?
First of all, it is being resisted in many parts of the country. And let me just say that if we're closing on the basis of safety, no question. If there's serious safety problems, now some people say there are just in general, but I'm talking about specific plant failures that require safety. So I'm not defending that with my amen. But the fact is that the state of New York, the state of New Jersey, the state of Illinois, and I've forgotten there's another one that's coming in now, they are actually providing some clean credit of some sort in their pricing system for those, what these generally are single plants that are not part of a, 2 or 3, well, there are very few 3 configurations in America, but 2 configurations are cheaper to run than 1. And so they are trying to compensate for that. And I think that is a very smart policy. And by the way, a number of environmental organizations are supporting or not protesting that at all to try to keep them alive. Now, this issue of internationally, though, the need for electricity is huge, and it's one reason I think we want to keep the nuclear option open, and one of the reasons for this notion of some of these technologies that we might be investing in on nuclear, on other things, including fusion, may be not for here, it may be for elsewhere. And this is such a serious problem that we need to keep those kind of options open. I'd like to say a lot more about nuclear, but time's up.
Thank you.
Thank you.